Welcome back again, Supply Chain Essentials, and we're looking at part 2 of how multinationals manage their suppliers in China, but we're looking at the example of Apple, and we're going through our list from 8 to 14 on how Apple manages its suppliers. Okay, number 8. Here's a very interesting one, because if we go up until about 2014-15, what happened? The technology of smartphone changed from a 3-layer screen to a 2-layer screen. Now 3 layers with the cover glass, which was really the Gorilla Glass, then there was a touch sensor, and then there's the LCD that you actually, the picture, the Android, the iOS unit that you see on the iPhone. Okay, and that's what you see. So there's 3 parts. But after 2014-15, what happened? The technology advanced, and then suddenly there became 2 parts where the touch sensor and the TFT LCD came together. All right, and so therefore that only had to be merged with the cover glass. Now what was very interesting was that Apple will actually control very specific elements of the machinery, like the machinery that actually joined these 2 parts together, or making the LCM module. What do I mean? And so in order to control those machines, they actually contracted with LG and other suppliers, but LG specifically, they put machines in LG's factory in China and said to LG, look, for the next 3 years we have 60% control over the capacity of the machine, and after 3 years you can keep the machine. And so that was a way of controlling the actual capability of the supplier of that very, very, very critical and strategic component. And so also it actually controlled xenophobic and political risks of Apple, because that factory that was making these components, even though it was totally under Apple's control because they controlled the machines that were making those components, that factory was basically another factory. It wasn't branded with Apple. So if there was any regulatory problem, any environmental risk, or any pollution, or anything going on politically, anything like that, it couldn't be linked back directly to Apple, even though Apple had total control. So this is way that Apple does control its xenophobic political risk in other countries. All right, and so if we look at number 9, Apple will go to suppliers and say, okay, cost down 5%. Well, actually, so do other smartphone manufacturers, Samsung, HTC, and others. Every 3 months, every 6 months, I go to suppliers. So customers are putting pressure on our final product. We need to pass that on to you. So can you just take your cost down another 5%? Now, it takes a very, very bold owner of a supplier to push back and say, sorry, no, we're not going to take down that 5%. We will negotiate for a lower amount, because we are investing in our facilities and innovating in order to capture your future product roadmap and be capable when you need us in the future. And so the supplier, if they're able to come back to Apple and argue this is the reason why we cannot wear a 5% cost down, then Apple will accept that. But it takes a very bold supplier and an owner knowing what they are doing to be able to do that. And most suppliers that I have contacted with were not able to do that. Their owners did not have that making the best component in the world mindset to be able to do that. And so that's how you can push back to a powerful buyer like Apple, and this component manufacturer actually did that. So if we have a look at the management of supplies, yes, Apple does rely a lot on technology, as you can see here. All right, this one here, this is D. They focus on technology, then quality, and then delivery. You know, these are the big things that they're looking for, and quality and delivery are coming close together after technology in terms of managing the call off of the purchase order from month to month to month to month. And remember, when they're ordering components from suppliers, the orders are in the hundreds of millions or the billions, because you imagine Apple was shipping 300 million over iPhones a year. Each of those iPhones have 180, 200 components. Multiply that out, you can see that there's a lot of components that need to be ordered every month. Wow. And so what you've got there, and I just showed you very briefly, what you've got here is actually a copy of an iPhone. This is an iPhone copy. This was made many, many years ago. But what was interesting is that in order to make an iPhone copy, you had to take shortcuts on different components. And here they take the shortcut on the LCD panel, which is directly soldered onto the main board. In the iPhone, it's actually screwed onto the main board, and so if this copy is dropped, then it will come apart and stop working. You know, there's little things that you can learn about the integration of smartphones by looking at how do they actually put copies together by taking shortcuts. Sometimes it actually is much more ingenious to show how a copy can be made compared to the real version. So I'm not here to show you how to make copies today, but I just want to show you that, you know, there's big business out there to actually make versions that are similar to famous smartphones that are on the market. Here we have the bill of materials, which is very, very important to understand what is going into the iPhone. Now, number 10, inventory management. Okay, Apple has the power to make the supplier hold capacity. That is, reserve capacity for Apple. Oh, we're not going to buy from you next month, but just in case we may need to buy from you in the next month, we want you to hold capacity. They will forecast plans out to 6 months. And so, Mr. Supplier, for the next 6 months, we want a contract with you to order from you, say, 100 million components. And so in month 1, they might order 200,000. In month 2, they might order 300,000. In month 3, they might order 100,000. And that may vary from month to month to month. And so that's how it is managing these huge volumes with suppliers. They are giving a loose forecast to suppliers that for the next 6 months, you need to be able to supply us, so, you know, 500 million components. And that's what they have to do. Okay. Number 11, right? Apple works with a second OEM manufacturer or a third one to enhance competition and choices. I remember when the iPad number 4 came out, and this is talking about 2013-14, Apple sought out quotations from Foxconn and Pegatron. Pegatron is another EMS manufacturer, just like Foxconn, but smaller, albeit. Anyway, Pegatron came through to Apple with actually a more expensive quotation for making the iPad compared to Foxconn, but Apple still went with Pegatron. Same with the iPhone 5 that came out. This was back 2014. Apple went with the more expensive quote from Pegatron. Now, why would Apple go with a more expensive supplier, EMS provider? And the reason is they didn't want Foxconn to create a monopoly of being the only EMS provider for Apple. They're actually working with Pegatron, create a little bit more competition, and that gives Apple more flexibility in going to one EMS provider for one product and another EMS provider for another product. Number 12, Apple's able to find out. Now, the big unknown that a lot of brand names have when working with their suppliers is the yield. In other words, how much input comes in for the output and how much wastage is there. If you know there's a bit of wastage, you can work with the supplier to actually improve that wastage to bring the yield up to 90%, 95%, 98%. Okay, obviously 100% is nearly impossible in a lot of these EMS component manufacturing factories. All right, so how does Apple do this when the suppliers are not always going to be forthcoming with the yield? Often suppliers will overstate their yield. If the yield is only 75%, they'll say it's 80%, or they'll say it's 85%. Because at 75%, you're telling Apple that you can improve by another third. You know, 1/3 of 75 plus 75 is 100. But if you're at 80%, you're telling Apple you can only improve by 1/4. And it's better to be able to say you can only improve by 1/4, because then Apple won't come back and say cut your costs or cut your price as much in the future. So in some ways, suppliers would like to misrepresent the yield or say they have a higher yield. But Apple can get around that because they actually control the materials coming into the supplier. So if I know what the inputs are coming in, I know the outputs are going out, I can actually calculate the yield myself. I don't have to be on the production floor or listen to the supplier to find out what the yield is. Number 13. How does Apple do all this monitoring, visiting the suppliers, watching them make a run at rate to see if they are going to become a approved supplier, just monitoring other aspects, or actually having visibility of the second tier, third tier suppliers? How do they do this? Well, they have 800 plus, maybe more these days, technical engineers on the ground, not just in China, but in Vietnam and in other countries around the world where they have EMS manufacturing going on and where there are their suppliers. And those engineers are employed by Apple, and they can visit the suppliers at less than a day's notice, and they go in and monitor at any time. Number 13. So that's how they do that, and very, very important. Number 14. Apple has extensive product testing in China, US, lots of bending, weights, drop tests, things like that. Of course, the whole issue in 2012 and 13, 14, when the Apple iPhone was bending in the pocket of the jeans, and that came out that they were doing a lot of stress tests on the iPhone to make sure that it doesn't bend like consumers found out. Of course, they have an EFFA, and that is early field failure analysis. Now, other brand names have this also, but not as extensive as Apple. In the first week of a product launch, and with the iPhone 13 launched just in the last week, in that week they have a lot of engineers in the marketplace testing the real product that is out in the marketplace to make sure they catch problems before consumers catch problems, and you know what that can lead to, reputation risk and other product recall concerns. So there you have it. There you have 14 ways in which Apple works with its suppliers, selects its suppliers, monitors its suppliers, works with its suppliers to, in some ways, it makes the iPhone great. It makes all of Apple's family of products great because they have exceedingly just unprecedented attention to quality and defect management in the supply chain. They have unprecedented visibility on the second tier, third tier material suppliers that are sending stuff to Foxconn for assembly. And so they just want to follow every little part of the supply chain, and they monitor that with hundreds of engineers on the ground every day that the supply chain is operating. There you have 14 ways in which Apple is working with its suppliers, and in a positive way they are actually making the suppliers' lives better because they are transforming suppliers into being world-class suppliers, supplying world-class supplier components to world-class brands. And that's how BYD got its leg up, and now it is a world-class car manufacturer making the largest number of e-vehicles in the world today. If it can be done for BYD, this kind of partnership with world-class brands can be done for many other suppliers, and that's what attracts suppliers to Apple, even though you may not make that much money by being an approved supplier of Apple, but it does give you a leg up in terms of volume expansion, and your brand recognition can just goes to an international level, and that creates many more opportunities with working with other brands or actually designing your own product in the future. That's the attraction for the suppliers, and that's why Apple is good for the suppliers and the suppliers are attracted to Apple. There you have Supply Chain Essentials Part 2, how large multinationals manage their suppliers, especially in the developing world. Catch you next time for Supply Chain Essentials. This is O'Connor. Bye for now.